Jamal Joe. Sidney Crosby, the golden goal.
For episode 3 of the Backstage Project podcast, I have Sam Galet who's joining us. So I've known Sam since the early 90s. We actually went to high school together. We went to university together for a while. And then Sam took off. He left Toronto. He went to the US. We're going to talk about today in the podcast how he went to Ohio State. He did something that at the time within our friend group, like no one really understood where he was going, but Sam was always so laser focused on what he wanted to do and what he wanted to become. And all these years later, as you'll listen to on today's podcast, he has accomplished an absolute ton. And I'm so proud of him, really happy to still call him my friend, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. Sam, welcome to the Backstage Project podcast. For those people who don't know Sam well, I do, and I've had a front row seat to watch him chase his dream, which continues to today, which is why he's joined us on the podcast. Sam, I don't want to go all the way back, to the high school days, our teenage years, when I recall you and I sharing many a laugh, riding the pine at the end of the bench for our high school senior basketball team. I wanted to fast forward a bit to university and thinking about undergrad, and as you made your way to grad school, you really surprised us all by deciding to go to Ohio State. So I want to look back. I want to look back at what you were thinking at the time, as you left the comforts of Toronto and home and all your friends and headed down to the States for school. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, when I was doing undergrad, I always had a vision to continue with postgrad. And at the time, like many of us, looking at MBA, law school, I remember writing my LSAT and my GMAT. But it really didn't speak to kind of where I wanted to go. And I always had a vision and a dream to go into the world of professional sports, being a sport agent, sports marketing, and through a program at York, the Sport Admin certificate program, it kind of opened my eyes and doors up. So, as I got into my fourth year, I looked at, can I extend and continue that journey in the world of sport? And I'd heard and learned about a lot of programs in the US, postgraduate programs, for a master's, or there's an MBA in sport marketing, a master's in sport marketing, and ended applying to a number of them, went down to a number of interviews, Ohio University, the Ohio State, and ended up accepting a position or a spot in the Ohio State University sport management program. And really what I was looking at that point, I felt that, my journey would best be continued in the US. Getting a graduate degree in the US opens up the door to a 3-year visa that could transition into, living in the US full time. So, I really felt that I need to continue my education, and B, I thought that the brand of a large D1 school in the US and the exposure really helped get me to where I need to go. I ended up taking a year off and traveling around the world. And when I came back, I moved down. My dad moved me down to Columbus, and, very different. I mean, York, where we both went to undergrad, is a big school, lots of students. Ohio State, or the Ohio State, was slightly larger. But the big difference between Canada and the US is really the athletics infrastructure. And, I remember, having worked in the school, because part of what they offer you is, in addition to doing your schoolwork and getting the degree, they also support you with roles and jobs within the university to get you experience. So I had gotten a job working in the finance department for the athletics department, the finance group, and then also the ice rink, which helped me cover most of my tuition and some of my additional costs. But what I realized is when you go to a school like the Ohio State, the entire budget of the athletics program was probably equal to the entire Canadian Football League and all 8 of their teams at the time. So that was kind of the big difference, going to and working on football games where you would have 100,000 people at the games, and donors writing checks for $50,000 or $100,000 to get their seats. At the time, they were in the process of looking at building a new arena for the school. They were in a 14,000 seat arena called St. John's. And after I left, they built a 20,000 seat arena for the basketball team. So it's just the infrastructure and the resources for sport, and having as a student access to that and seeing the inner workings, where it's really run as a professional sports franchise. That was a really big eye opener for me. And that really helped. I was able to, my greatest value coming out of that program was the experience I got in the athletics department, not necessarily anything from the actual school programs or school courses that I took.
Well, let's say the party was probably for the undergrads. You professional students, you had other objectives in mind.
Yeah, no, listen, you walk around the campus and you see all the big fraternities and the sorority houses, very similar to the movies. As a grad student, really didn't get to experience that. I went down there with a focus to, work, get my degree, and come back and find a job. I think a lot of that's left for undergrad, but it was a great experience. And being able to go to a campus like that and having a brand like the Ohio State University on your resume, and the networking both for the current students, because a lot of those students are very, are very successful today, and then having access to the alumni, because a lot of what you're buying is access to the alumni, and being able to network and dig into their, connect with them after you leave, which could open up doors as well. But yeah, it was a great experience.
Sam, listening to you now talk about it and thinking back to how close we were back then. I should have listened to you a lot more. It sounds like you really knew back then exactly the way the world works and how you move around. And what we do know is you did come home. You did come back to Toronto. And while I don't need you to talk a lot about why you came back to Toronto, unless it comes out as part of what you're going to talk about here, but you ended up landing a job with Chris Lang. And for anyone who doesn't know who Chris is, well, you're obviously not in the Canadian partnerships business. Chris, in some regard, has been called a living legend. So I'd like to get your sense of what it was like to start your career, with Chris and with, I guess, what's called Lang and Associates, or the Gem Group at the time. And what did you learn? And if you could think, I guess specifically, you're coming out of the U.S. Let's call it you're a hotshot Ohio State sports management master's grad, and you're looking to make your name in the business. What's it like to work for pretty much the top guy in the field in Canada?
Yeah, listen, when I came back to Canada, I came back because I was gone for over 2 years. I missed my family, and I felt that the value of the degree I had would be more valuable in Canada, where at that point in time there wasn't very many, if any, post-grad programs, master's degrees in sport marketing. So I felt I could leverage that for the right job. Unfortunately, when I came back, there wasn't a lineup of people looking to hire me. I had to really network hard, and I did that through the year or year plus I was away at Ohio State, and I ultimately got the job at Lang and Associates. Through Brian Lang, who was Chris's son, Dan Thompson, and a few other people that interviewed me and really saw value and potential in me. It was great. I didn't know at the time how significant Chris was and how significant that company was or was going to be for my career. I knew that they worked in sport. They consulted to a number of clients in the world, Canadian Tire, Molson, on their sports strategy. Coke being a big one. They'd follow Coke around the world, around Olympics, and they set up offices and whether it was Tokyo, whether it was Atlanta, Sydney, leading up to the Olympics to help build the programs. But I got a job there, and it took me 6 months after coming back and networking. And I would say that Chris, if people don't know who Chris is an icon. He was very heavily involved. When he was, I think he was the Secretary of Hockey Canada in building the 72 Summit Series. Him and Alan Eagleson were very close, and he was, a lot of the, architect behind that 72 series. He also was helped bring the Olympics to Calgary in 1988. So he has a long history of being involved in sport, in pioneering sport, and the administration of sport in Canada. But at the time when I got a job at Lang and Associates, the biggest value was that there was a lot of really smart people in the industry working at that company at the time. And you don't realize that until 10, 20 years later. You look back at the alumni and seeing a lot of the leading people in the world of sport all came from Lang. But for me, it was the networking. It gave me the foundation, because I did two things at Lang. Number one, I worked on client consulting. So I worked on a number of companies like Canadian Tire, Molson, in the US, some things like Sears, which really opened the door for me on how to architect sponsorship from a client side. But I always had a vision and an interest to sell. I love to sell, even when dating back to York. I put together and you remember this, I put together a volleyball tournament called the Mizuno Excalibur Volleyball Classic. And I remember going out and selling sponsorship, and I got 10,000 CDs from BMG Music on Shaquille O'Neal. And, we were able to give those away, but the caveat of that was we had to play the music. And I remember asking you, Mark, to come and DJ. And, I think people, as much as they liked Shaquille O'Neal at the time, they wanted to probably crack the CDs in half because they were listening to too much. And even going out and getting, Lifesavers to be a sponsor and giving me, I don't know how many tens of thousands of Lifesaver sours, which was a new product at the time. I remember getting holes in the side of my mouth from sucking on so many of those Lifesavers. But I had a real vision and passion for going out and creating deals and finding sponsors. And, that was my passion. And so, and I was able to articulate that to Chris when I was at Lang. And they had a kind of a unique division at Lang. It was probably 3 or 4 people in that group. And their mandate or remit was to consult to properties. So while the larger group at Lang was to consult to clients, the Kochs, the Molsons, this small group was architecting or engineering sponsorship for properties or leagues, events, teams. And I was led by a guy at the time named Dan Thompson. Dana Gladstone was also in that group as well, and another guy named Doug Mitchell. So I had, kind of, split my time between Architectus, which was the name of the group, and Lang. And eventually I ended up, selling sponsorship on behalf of Architectus for things like Ontario Place, government missions, trade missions for the federal government of Canada. So that really kind of, got me the real experience in sales. I was able to really, launch my career in that whole space. But yeah, it was a great company. I still keep in touch with everyone from that group. We had at that point in time hundreds of people in the company. It wasn't a niche company. It's fairly substantial. And through that time, we ended up merging with a big U.S. company called Corporate Marketing Associates and became known as a GEM Group. And then, after that merger, I ended up leaving.
Well, to hear you talk about these things, a couple things resonate for me in particular. One is the concept of a network and a cohort or a community. These people who you meet in tranches, along your career, and some of them you absolutely shed for various reasons, geography, personality, whatever, and others you kind of stick through and you maintain those friendships. I didn't realize so early in your career you were actually working on non-sports properties, so which is great. We're going to get into that a little bit later in our chat today.
Yeah, networking is important because I remember sitting in the office and two desks away from me was Shannon Hosford, who's the CMO for Maple Leaf Sports. So she was my colleague. I had Paul Jolly at Across, who I had hired, and Paul's the AVP of Sun Life. I had Dan Kuzmarov on one side of me. And Dan is well known in the world of athletes, and he's a partner in Manifesto right now. Going back to remember who else. Heather McLean was right down the hall, who ran sponsorship globally for Labatt's for a number of years. So there's a lot of Jen Del Vecchio was near me, and Jen ended up leading sponsorship for Coke, and now she's in Atlanta. So I'm just going back, and if I can start naming off like 50 more people in that group that from that company that were very successful, and all those people got their start at Lang, which made it, and now they're in my network, but they're colleagues of mine. And working on events, working long hours with, you build a bond with a lot of those people. So yeah, it was great.
Well, the more I hear you talk about it, the more I'm starting to understand how you've been able to be so successful here in Canada, because you know where you worked with, like the movers and shakers, from early days in your career, early days in their career as well. And when you talk about the way that Lang kind of separated itself into the selling side and the property side, we've seen many other organizations to today who are trying to strike that balance and have that kind of separation to be credible and authentic, to be able to do both. But it's really not easy to do. Maybe we'll talk about that a little later. What I wanted to do is I wanted you to, since we have gone back in time, about 20, 25 years almost, thinking about back then. I mean, the landscape is clearly different today. I mean, when we say today, obviously we're talking about
pre-COVID-19.
Yes, not exactly today. But when you're looking at properties, agencies, and the way they operate today, when you think back to what it was like in the late 90s when you got into this, what are the new challenges that you could never have forecasted that have come up? I mean, maybe in the last 10 to 15 years that back in the late 90s weren't even a thing you spent any time on.
Yeah, I mean, the world has changed so much. I mean, back when I started, social media didn't exist. The internet was around, but it was at the kind of the beginning stages of what it is today. E-commerce didn't exist. So I think there's a lot of at that point, sponsorship was kind of one of the, new types of marketing that companies were looking to take advantage of. If you wanted to access a community of passionate fans, the best way to do that would be through a sponsorship, which would give you intellectual property rights and access to that community. These days, you want access to community, Facebook, can target it so easily. So there's influencers and their communities. Influencer marketing has become really, really big. So there's so many. The world has evolved, and the space has evolved so much that it's very different. I think very different. And as we enter COVID-19, and you think of sponsorship, a big part of sponsorship is experiential marketing, is having that one-on-one interaction with fans, which we can't run right now. I mean, we tell people, events are really the anti-social distancing business. So it's the whole world has changed, but it's become a lot more sophisticated. You have to be, you can't just be a specialist in sponsorship. You have to understand integrated marketing and understand how everything connects. Sponsorship and the IP of a property may sit in the middle, but there is a complete connection with the personalities and the athletes and their communities and digital. And you think of athletes right now. Athletes have their own websites, their own social channels. They're putting out their own. You think of all the Players Tribune and all these other digital assets. They're writing their own stories on those. So it's very different. You really have to be a lot smarter and think about things a lot more holistically.
Well, thanks for that. And I know the world obviously is all that today, but I do want to challenge you on one thing, and I'm looking forward to hearing your perspective. So you mentioned that you left Lang around the time of that, I guess, the Gem Group being created, or the acquisition of that, and you went to live audio wrestling, and as an executive, and I think we were like 25 at the time, and I might have had the title of manager maybe back then. So it was a shock to all of us. One, that you made the move. And two, that you had such a senior position. I don't know if we were envious. You're going to let us know. But looking back on that business, and I know you left maybe within a couple of years, and we don't have to go into
1 year. It was 1 year.
We don't have to go into why you left.
Yeah.
But thinking about that business, and I know that it evolved and morphed into something that was kind of sustainable in time. But from what I remember about that business, it had a lot of the themes present that you just described around the way the world is today. So would you say that business was the way it was when you were there was ahead of its time?
Yeah, listen, I think, it was ahead of its time. A lot of the components that we talk about, it had a, it started as websites, for content, websites for professional wrestlers. And, if I remember at the time, there was a company in non-wrestling called Athlete Direct, which was building a lot of websites for athletes. We had a wire service that provided news on professional wrestling. That was a partnership with the Toronto Star. We had developed a number of books that ended up, we did a deal with, I think, McClellan Stewart or an offshoot of them, and, ended up producing 3 or 4 books. So yeah, there's a lot of content. I mean, I think ultimately, what we didn't have that a lot of these companies have now is we didn't have a lot of runway, a lot of VC capital. A lot of these companies now that exist, I don't know how profitable they are. I think they have a lot of investment and they have a long runway to eventually be successful. We didn't have that runway. You could argue that wrestling maybe was a little bit more niche, and fighting would have been, UFC was coming out at the time and starting to kind of compete with WWE, but we didn't have enough of VC. We had friends and family, and after we ran out of that, we didn't have enough revenue to sustain us, and I think ultimately that's one of the reasons why I ended up leaving.
No, listen, it was an interesting time. The dot-com bubble happened all around that time.
Yeah,
and we all had to make an adjustment. Probably, as we project forward, probably a similar adjustment that we're all going to be making in the months and even years ahead from today. But we're not there yet. We're still celebrating the past.
Absolutely.
And if we jump forward a bit in your life, in your career, we'll skip some of the middle stages where you did some amazing things. You ended up at IMG, and this is a part of your job that I was always envious of, never truly understood. But you got to hang around with like the most revered Canadian, basically of our generation, the king of Canadian sports, if we had to crown one, Wayne Gretzky. And first question, how long did it take you to stop being a fan when you actually got the chance to talk and meet and deal with Wayne?
Listen, when you work in the business, you can always be a fan, but you gotta separate being a fan and being a business. So Wayne wasn't the first athlete that I'd worked with or I'd come across. I mean, we had very close relationships with Mike Weir. After he won the Masters, he was a client of ours. Steve Nash. I mean, all the golfers, Stephen Ames, Mike Weir, Laurie Kane, Ian Leggett, they're all clients of ours out of Canada, out of Toronto. A lot of the figure skaters, the Kurt Brownings. Steve Nash was a client for a number of years, kind of at the tail end of his career. We ran events like the Skins game where I'd be, or the Legends of Golf, or Jack Nicklaus, and Sergio Garcia. So when you're in the business and you're around the athletes all the time, or the personalities, like, you can be a fan. I've never asked for an autograph. My kids still yell at me for not getting Gretzky's, 3 signed jerseys from Wayne. But I was never that type of person to, ask for anything. And, listen, Wayne, I was always a fan of Wayne's. I told him when I first met him that, I had met him when I was 6 years old at a hockey, banquet in outside of Hamilton, where I grew up. Because he was 19 at the time, 18 at the time. But yeah, listen, you're always a fan, but they're all human, right? At the end of the day, no matter how great an athlete as Steve Nash is or Wayne Gretzky, they're human, and they have human issues and human problems, and they have families. Wayne has, many kids, and, he's a father, and, he's a grandfather now. So at the end of the day, they're just human. And once you get to know them as human beings, you can be a fan, but like, you got to deal with them on a human level.
All right, fair enough. I get it. Absolutely, you should have taken the chance to. I'm sure you got some pictures, but autographs, I'll let your kids be the judge and jury on that one. But there is one particular part of Wayne's history that you're a Leaf fan, right?
Yeah.
So did you ever talk about the infamous Game 6 in 1993? And I'll say that, we generally forget about Game 7, where Wayne basically put the Kings on his back to get to the Cup final, and they eventually lost to the Habs. And that was the last time a Canadian team won the Stanley Cup. But did Game 6 ever come up?
No, not really. I mean, listen, he's been to a lot of Toronto Maple Leaf games. We used to share seats with Walter when we ended up. Wayne was a client Wayne was a client twice. He was a client for most of his career, and then when his agent left to go to the Phoenix Coyotes, he left, and then we brought him back about 6 years ago. But when he was a client the first time, we ended up buying 6 seats at the Air Canada Centre when it was built. Now it's called Scotiabank Arena, and we split the seats with Walter. Or with Wayne. He had 3, we had 3. So I'd sit next to Walter many times at Maple Leaf games. So Wayne's always been a fan of Toronto, but grew up in Brantford. I mean, so we didn't get into too much of it. I mean, he has fond memories of playing in Toronto. He's a huge network here. His brother, his father, they're all still here. But yeah, we never got into too much about, that infamous game. I think one small part of Wayne would have liked to play in Toronto, but, I guess that was never meant to be.
I think a small part of all of us would have liked to have seen Wayne play in Toronto. And just to kind of close off on Wayne, because we don't want to make it all about Wayne, it could easily be all about Wayne. Did he ever pick up his Order of Canada?
I'm not sure if he did or not.
Okay, fair enough.
No, that's all. I'll leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that. Okay, let's move off sports for a bit.
Sure.
As we've heard, you're so much more than sports in your career. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what it was like going from wrestling, then you went into the CFL. I know you had a stint at another agency in between there, but you got testosterone on wrestling and the CFL, and then you're running properties in fashion and food, and maybe talk us through the lessons that you learned as you pivoted toward these bigger, more, I call them cultural or really trendy events, things that you've learned that kind of stick with you today that maybe sports didn't really give to you.
Yeah, listen, I mean, every property is the same. They all have communities that are passionate about their specific content. They all have unique ways to talk to the consumer, and they all have unique intellectual property. Intellectual property. So, I mean, the big difference between a lot of big sporting events and a lot of big cultural or entertainment events is that, a lot of sports events are broadcast. There's a broadcast component. They're on TV. There's certain value that you get if you watch the Raptors or the Leafs. You see a lot of the brands that support them through the rink boards or through the signage. A lot of cultural events don't have that. So you have to be a little bit, different in how you architect a partnership. IMG wasn't the first time I started working in culture or arts. When that one agency that I worked for between the CFL and live audio wrestling was a company called Wakeham and Associates. And so, they didn't do any sports. I worked on Cirque du Soleil and I worked on the Blue Man Group. And I remember doing the naming rights to the Blue Man Group Theater in Toronto. It's called the Panasonic Theater. But they're all. I mean, listen, it's all about how do you activate the IP, and Blue Man Group was all about technology and innovation, and dynamic, and the Cirque du Soleil was all about creative and also innovation to an extent. So how do you activate that unique IP to really suit the needs of a brand? But yeah, the biggest difference is you just don't have a lot of the traditional big value of the broadcast components in an agreement. As we move forward, some of those properties have larger social communities now, more now than ever. So that's something that a lot of you can create bespoke content, digital content now, which is a big area. But yeah, I mean, those were interesting times. I mean, I worked on Fashion Week, Toronto Fashion Week for many years, and that was an event where it was all about money can't buy experiences and exclusive access, and really activating around Canadian designers, and that was a innovation, to culinary, which was completely different, and again, a lot of the same similarities between fashion and culinary. But when it's all said and done, a lot of the same attributes that you take from sport are applicable to entertainment, applicable to culture, and really it's about building relationships with clients. If you have a relationship with a CMO, head of sponsorship, and you have their trust, and you've built them a proposition or a partnership for a sports property, leverage that relationship and a lot of the same tools to create something around fashion or culinary or entertainment is very similar. And so if you look at my career and a lot of the relationships I've created, I've been able to transition those relationships. I remember, L'Oreal was a client of mine for many years, L'Oreal Paris and then Maybelline New York for Toronto Fashion Week. And that same relationship and that same client, I was able to transition into a multi-year partnership for Garnier and Umbrella with the women's national soccer team and the Canadian Soccer Association. Again, very similar attributes. How are they going to leverage Maybelline in fashion and Umbrella in soccer? But it was the same relationship, the same people, and a lot of the same framework to build a partnership.
It's amazing to hear you talk about all the brands and the different applications of your skills to be able to drive value for partners and obviously revenue for properties. And we won't go deep into this, but thinking about the world now, it seems like every facility, whether that's a sporting facility or recreational facility or a mall, really, you name it, they're all looking for sponsorship. We know that our friend Chris Lang he's big into the what I would call the mass transit infrastructure, whether it's airports or trains or subway, and working with them. So it's just amazing to see the evolution, and not just about the sign, but it's also about the experiences that have been created over time in these locations as well. Amazing to see it.
Yeah. Listen, absolutely. I mean, I still believe if you think of what is sponsorship and what is the root and the core of sponsorship, it's really about. I mean, I'll tell people it's the Olympics, right? When you buy the Olympics and you're a global sponsor, you're a top sponsor of the Olympics, and you're spending lots of money on a 4-year and 8-year quadrennial partnership. You're really not buying signage. You're not. What you're buying is IP. You're buying the association with the rings, and how can that association with the rings, elevate your brand and your proposition? And that's what sponsorship is. So sponsorship is been used loosely. I think a lot of it's been confused with outdoor, experiential. So that's how a lot of the stuff I work on is true sponsorship is there a value if you buy a sponsorship with a property, is there value to promote a relationship with the name and the IP of that property? And if there's not, then is it really a sponsorship, or is it something else? Is it sampling? Is it experiential? Anyway, so it's just a side topic.
No, it's really important to round out the topic, and we for the scope of what we're talking about today, we won't get into the various ecosystem of agencies that support partners with how you execute, but it is complicated, but that is the world we live in today when marketing is not simple. I'd like to take you back a little bit, not too far back in the past, just back a few years. So when I was thinking myself about the acquisition of IMG by WME, I didn't know WME other than because I didn't spend a career in the film and television business. I didn't know they were 125-year-old agency. They basically invented the agency model to begin with, and I understand that the world that you're living in now, which is more the Endeavour world, with Ari Emanuel, is is the reality of today for your business. And quite frankly, I didn't know who Ari Emanuel was, except for the comparisons with Ari Gold and Entourage. So that's my whole education of your world. And obviously it was very different from the world that I am in. But if you think to this time, because you've been here the whole time, at least from the Canadian perspective, when you think to this time as you saw IMG, become WME IMG to become Endeavour, how is that Hollywood flair that is very much in the DNA of Endeavour and WME impacted the sports practice with what used to be IMG?
I mean, I still work. I mean, I still work at IMG. I mean, IMG is part of Endeavour. Endeavour is like our, think of a holding company. It's a network. It's IMG is the Google, and Endeavour is the Alphabet. I think, when you think of our company, we just are so connected in every facet of the world of sport and entertainment. That no matter what you watch, no matter what you see, we have a touch point. We were talking last night about The Last Dance. We co-finance The Last Dance through Endeavour Original Content. The producer of The Last Dance is a WME client. Scottie Pippen is a WME client. So we're so connected in everything. All that means is that we have the ability to really offer a access and an offering that nobody else can offer, and we have the ability to leverage every relationship for a different relationship. So when I think of our group, I mean, we announced early this year, a new event that we created with The Rock, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. The Rock is probably one of our largest clients at WME. Everybody knows The Rock. Connection to Canada. Used to play at the CFL early in his career. One of the best professional wrestlers, and now probably the most iconic Hollywood movie star. But him and his business partner Danny Garcia always had a vision to build a fitness and athletics festival. Any other agency wouldn't, it would just be a discussion. We were able to transition, take that vision of Danny and Dwayne and launch an event called Athleticon, which was scheduled to take place this October in Atlanta, and we're still working through that. But it's just access, right? Like, when Endeavour acquired part of UFC, we were able to then take equity offerings to, I think it was 20 or 25 WME clients. So I guess the connections. I mean, we just announced a program the other day around Super Mario Tennis, and we're going to be doing an event on Facebook Live with many of our top tennis athletes that are going to be playing against each other for charity. So it's just the access. Our digital group, in our sports clients group, and our tennis group, or everyone's working together. So it's just amazing, and that's kind of the power of our company. There's nothing we can't do. In that world, and there's nothing we don't have access to. It's just, how do we harness the full power to achieve the best results?
Well, so that sounds really exciting, and you did a terrific job of bringing it together so that people who aren't in the day-to-day and don't understand the minutiae of how Endeavour and its holding companies work, hopefully when they listen to you talk on this podcast, will have a great idea of what makes the company so great. So thinking through, how we structure this, the Backstage project, we do ask every guest a couple questions, and there are a couple here that you actually already answered, so we won't bother going into those. But there are a couple that I'd like to ask. Just give us your off-the-cuff kind of response, and we'll see how it goes. So, if you had to pick one moment, in your career, what was the most memorable?
The most memorable moment. There's so many. I'm trying to think through. I remember being at the 2002 Grey Cup. I'm trying to think, it was 2002 Grey Cup in Edmonton. And I put together a partnership for Lotto 649. They had just celebrated their 20th anniversary, and they wanted to do a special draw. So I architected a program where in the month of October, they do a special draw for up to 49 winners that would get a all expense paid trip to Edmonton at the time, and then they would all be brought onto the field, and they do a special draw for $6.49 million. I remember being at the Grey Cup and watching that transpire, and it was a couple. I think they were kind of newly immigrated to Canada. I think they were janitors at the University of Calgary, and they'd won the $6.49 million prize on the field at the Grey Cup. But I guess watching that, I mean, again, as a salesperson and as an architect, when you build something and you see it come to fruition, those are great times. And I can go back through my career and remember 30 of those opportunities that have come to fruition in unique circumstances. But that would be one that existed. I remember another point, when I started IMG, I was quick to do a number of large programs at IMG, which kind of set me apart from everybody else on my team. But I remember, one of the quick things I had done was we had done some work with I think it was the World Snowboarding Tour. I don't know if that's they did a number of events around the world, and we were running an event in Whistler, and we called it Snow Scene. So I remember doing a small deal at the time. Online poker was becoming very big, and I did a small deal with a local advertising agency. I think it was McKinnon Calderwood out of Mississauga with Party Poker, and they become a sponsor. It's broadcast on CBC. So I went up to Whistler, and this is funny because I'm not a skier. I never really skied. I never grew up skiing. I never snowboarded. Once I snowboarded and I almost broke my wrist. But I remember I'd done a deal with them, and then their global head of sponsorship out of Gibraltar flew up and wanted to be there. And so I didn't realize at the time that the actual site of the snowboarding event was up in the mountain. And the only way to get there was to ski. So, I remember talking to him, and, he's like, okay, I'll meet you up at the site. And I go back to one of my colleagues, Skip, his name was Skip, Mark Taylor. I said, what do I do? And he goes, just get your snowboard, get your skis, go up on the lift and ski down. I'm like, I don't ski. So they had to organize a snowmobile for me. And I remember going up in the ski lift with no skis. Everyone's looking at me. And there's a snowmobile waiting at the top that took me down. So I thought that was interesting. But literally 2 hours later, I remember, being at the site with this guy, Piotr was his name. He was a great guy. And, he said to me, wouldn't it be great to do a poker event where you bring the top athletes from snowboarding and surfing and wakeboarding together and create some type of global poker tournament? I'm like, yeah, that'd be great. And I remember coming back to the office and spoke to my boss at the time, Brad, and Brad's like, yeah, call up James out of LA, our LA office. He could help you. So I ended up calling James, and literally 4 months later, we ended up doing a multi-million-dollar partnership, and we created literally 6 events around wakeboarding and snowboarding and skateboarding, and had the best athletes playing poker against each other. It was amazing. So those are kind of key moments. I probably have 50 more of those, but to see things come up with creative ideas and see them come to fruition and how they materialize are always great.
No, thanks for sharing those. And I think when I talk to other people, more in the technology space and entrepreneurs, this concept of ideas are cheap, execution is everything. And it sounds like you've been able to see many of those ideas through and build them into something not just real, but sustainable, and hopefully created some kind of positive ROI for your clients. And a lot of people would only dream of being able to have that kind of success. So thanks for sharing those nuggets of how those moments of, eureka happened for you. Because those are buried deep inside all of us. And it's great to do chats like this where we get to talk about them and celebrate them, but also learn from them. And really for people who are listening, it's not easy. Coming up with the idea is hard enough, but being able to see it through, have the work ethic to see it through. I mean, that's something that I've known about Sam I think we've known each other for over 30 years. And absolutely that whole time, that work ethic, that focus that you've had, very envious of it. I have a lot of it myself too, but I didn't have it when we were 16 and 17, when you were basically an encyclopedia of last night's sports page in the Toronto Star. You already knew it by the next morning. And there was no internet back then. So that was always impressive. So thinking back to that time, as we quickly wound the clock back, for people who are looking to get into the space now, and let's assume when there is a normal, so not at this very moment. For people looking to get into the space now, what kind of advice would you have for them?
It's funny. I get emails. I just got an email literally 10 minutes before our this interview on people reaching out to me, and I have a son, I have a daughter, I have a friends, son, whoever the case is, want to get into the industry. So I do a lot of these calls. Yes, it's very challenging. Listen, it's a phenomenal industry. It's a phenomenal space. But if you think about it, how many jobs really exist, entry level jobs? exists, and how many programs exist now in the university system that are being built specifically for this industry. I think now Brock, Laurentian, Ryerson's just launched a program. You have the colleges like George Brown. York doesn't have a sport admin program, but obviously there's a lot of people coming out of York wanting to get into the space. They have a sport business association. So you have thousands of people coming specifically from these programs graduating, and then you have everybody else who loves sport that want to get into the industry. So my advice is, there's two pieces of advice. Number one, if you want to get into the industry at the entry level position, your best bet is to find a very specific program, whether it's undergrad or whether it's a post-event program that has an internship. And, if they have a good, George Brown would be an interesting program. They do, I think, 3 cycles or 2 cycles now, but they've been around a long time and they have relationships with a lot of the different organizations. So your best bet to get into the door is through an internship. And then it's proving yourself. We would hire 1 to 2 interns a year. We have up to 15 interns a year at IMG, during the height of our times, recently over the last couple of years. Maple Leaf Sports does the same thing. You want to get into Maple Leaf Sports, you get to be an intern, and then you become the cream of the crop, and then they'll hire you. If you're not the cream of the crop, they won't hire you, but you get good experience. But then it's up to you. It's a proving ground. Like it's like being a professional athlete at every level. You're in the minor leagues. You got to be the best. Then you get elevated. It's the same thing in the industry. There's so many people that want to get in and be in it that, it's hard. And so you got to figure out a way to get your foot into the door. And then it's up to you. It's very difficult to stay in the industry as well. I see so many people that I knew at different levels of my career that are completely out of the industry, because as you get more senior, there's less jobs. It's like reverse. It's like a pyramid. There's less jobs as you get more senior. So the internship would be the first, I guess, piece of advice. The second piece of advice is, don't get into the industry now. Go out and become a specialist in digital marketing. Go and work for a brand. If you're coming out of a BBA, a BCom, an MBA, go be a brand manager. Go be a head of marketing. Go work in something that may have a connection to sport. So you may go run, a brand in Nike or an Adidas or in media, and become an expert. And then kind of midway through your career, make the jump, or even 3-4 years in, because then you have maybe a different level, a different value proposition than someone coming right out of school. But it's tough, right? And an example of someone like that would be, a George Dudas. George worked, I don't know how many years, 10 years in Labatt's, was a brand manager for Bud Light, for many of these different brands. And, he decided he always wanted to be in the world of sport. And so eventually he got a role in partnerships. I think it was the NFL, NBA. He's worked at the NFL and NBA. Now he's at the NHL. But again, if you come with a mindset of, you're a brand manager, you activated sponsorship, you know how a brand works, that is a different value proposition to someone who doesn't have that experience. So those would be the 2 pieces of advice I would give. It's just very competitive as well. So, don't give up. If you're committed and you want to be in the industry, figure it out. And, if you're smart, you're motivated, you're ambitious, you will get into it. And I've had lots of discussions with people that I've, had discussions with 10 years ago, and I would tell them the same thing. It's very difficult. It's very hard. And then 10 years later, I meet them again, and they'd be in the industry, and they persevered. So they found the inner drive to make it. But it's not an easy industry, and it's an industry that 90% of the people, 10% of the people make 90% of the money. So if you think you're getting into the world because you're going to make a lot of money, I would tell you, maybe like if you become a CEO or a president or a CMO, of a big organization, that's going to be the case. But you have to have a passion for it. If you want to make a lot of money, go into private equity. Go work for a startup where you get equity. Do something, do something else. Don't get into this industry if you want to make it rich. You will eventually, if you become, 20 years from now, but it should be a motivating factor. Michael Downey told me that. I think Michael Downey's the president of tennis, CEO of Tennis Canada, and he's had a very storied career. And I remember doing an informational interview with him, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning, at the Raptors, because at that time he was the VP of partnerships 22, 23 years ago. And he said, just get the job, doesn't matter what you make, get into the right organization, and just build your resume. Because at some point you will make money, but that shouldn't be your focus the first 5-10 years of your career.
No, listen, you You've had a great career, as you've described today. There absolutely has been ups and downs. I know we focused a little more on the ups for today, but it's important for people to realize that they have to persevere. They have to want it. This is not just about passion. You know, you might like sports, you might like art, you might like food, and that's okay. You know, liking what you do is super important, but there's no substitute for hard work. And I don't know if you actually have an answer for this next question, because you might have already described it about 10 different ways already in our chat today. But is there anything, when you look back to the kind of beginning of your career, is there anything that you know now that you wish you knew then?
Yeah, the only thing, I mean, the two pieces of advice I could give, and it's advice because, I should be taking it as well. Number one, always value everybody in your company and even the interns in your company, because you never know where someone's going to be. So, having been at IMG for close to 15 years, we've had a lot of great interns. And maybe at certain points in my career, I've had so many interns, I don't know half their names anymore. They all look the same. But, really, pay attention to that, because you never know where someone's going to be. And now when I look back at the history, especially some of the younger interns from earlier in my career, they're in very, very senior positions. So it's about building relationships externally and internally. The same thing with your colleagues. I mean, I remember Brian Lang telling me, he always tried to take out or go to lunch with a different colleague every week, because it's like that's their network as well. Your colleagues are going to be colleagues for a year, 2 years, 6 months, but you never know where they're going to end up, and they could be your biggest biggest assets in your network. So those are two pieces of advice I think are important. Manage your colleagues and your internal relationships as are external, and also build relationships with people like interns, because at some point they may be CEOs of a company if they're very good, and they could be very valuable to your network as well.
So that is very insightful and helpful perspective on the world in general, regardless of what industry our listeners might be in. I've asked a lot of questions today, conscious of your time, because I know you're just running to the next thing. But in the time we do have, is there anything that's burning on your chest that you wanted to get out that maybe I haven't covered?
I've had an interesting career. I mean, I think we talked about most of my roles, the wrestling, the Lang, the Canadian Football League, it's, and I spent 15 years almost at my company. I love, IMG and Endeavour. It's a phenomenal company, and being 15 years in a company is a long time. I mean, especially in this day and age. But yeah, listen, all I can say is, listen, we didn't get too much into COVID-19. The world now is very different than it was 2-3 months ago. And, hoping that we'll be back to normal, sooner than later, because, the entire world of professional sports and events and experiential is like many other, industries is challenged. But listen, I'm optimistic about that. And, I guess, I think I work for a phenomenal company. So I don't know if there's nothing else I want to, unless you have any specific questions or topics we didn't cover.
No. And by any means, I mean, this is not meant to be an audit at all. This is meant to be an insightful chat, learning a bit about you, obviously giving a lot of value to the audience, so they learn what it's like to have kind of a one-on-one private chat with Sam when he takes a trip down memory lane, and you absolutely delivered on that. I really appreciate that you took the time to join us today. I hope you and your family are well and are staying safe, and I absolutely look forward to seeing you again physically soon, but just thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, no problem.
The Backstage Project podcast is brought to you by Ready, Set, Go. They help organizations create extraordinary digital products. To learn more, go to readysetgo.design. If you would like to get in touch with Mark and the team at the Backstage Project podcast, please email us at info@tpbpodcast.com.